All right, we're going to get started here. My name is Robert Nelson. I'm with Division of Engineering Research, and we help work with the faculty to submit research proposals related to NSF, NIH, and all of the other sponsors. And today we have a special guest from within the university to talk about NSF specifically, and to help you answer questions related to any points and tips that you can use towards your NSF proposals. And so I'm going to turn it over, and she will go ahead and provide a presentation.
Hi, everybody. I first want to thank Kelly Martin for the invitation to come join you today for some lunch. And I want to thank everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here and talk a little bit about NSF proposal preparation. So to start, how many people here are actively working on NSF proposals? One, two, and everyone else is thinking about preparing an NSF proposal? Great. That means most people are at an early stage, so that's good. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Sarah Steenrod. My background is in neuroscience. I have a PhD from Columbia University and did a postdoc at Rockefeller University. Before I came to MSU in November of last year, I was working at the Washington University in St. Louis, their Institute for Clinical and Translational Sciences, as the scientific editor. And so there I worked with faculty developing their grant proposals and manuscripts. So I'm here on behalf of the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research and Innovation. They have a tremendous number of resources available to you as you prepare your grant proposals. So I highly recommend that you check out their website. And they have me and they have one other grant consultant, Tom Holland, who are available to meet with you. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that at the end of my talk. But just right here, just for your reference, if you'd like to meet with me the next time I'm on campus, this is the email address that you should contact. And I'm here for 1 week per month, and we can schedule an hour-long session to talk about whatever you want to talk about. It doesn't really matter where you are in your proposal preparation. If you're just thinking about applying, we can talk about whether or not you've picked out the right funding opportunity. If you have a draft you'd like me to look at, you can send it to me and we can talk about it. And better yet, if you have already applied and you didn't get it and you have some reviews that you want to dissect and discuss, go ahead and send them to me and we can develop a strategy for attacking the next submission. So why am I here? This is probably not news to anybody in this room. It's really hard to get funding. The NSF funding rates are low, so this is just a table of the funding rates by directorate for the last 2 years. And the take home here is that NSF funding rates hover at approximately 23 to 24%. So their overall budget for the year is $8 billion, or just shy of $8 billion, but it has to go a long way. The news is even worse for you guys because the engineering directorate is actually lower than that. It's actually 19%. So the take home here is that you should do everything that you can to get a competitive advantage. So how do you gain this competitive edge? I've looked at a lot of grants. I have some thoughts on this, but first I will let NSF themselves tell you what they think you should and shouldn't do. So just to preempt this, so what this is a video that's available online. So NSF has these grants conferences. This is one from 2017. And this session was on merit review. So they have these panelists. These panelists are all program directors and program officers with the NSF. And people have been asking them questions about merit review.
Yeah, hi. So these are sort of, what you have listed are things that, I think I would think of maybe. But what are some of the sort of I'll just say dumb things that people do? Beyond the obvious things of not responding to the criteria and things like that. What is it, the top 10 mistakes people make?
Failure to read the solicitation.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Reading the solicitation.
Right, that you have a specific solicitation, we're looking for certain something. This may be a great idea or even a great proposal, but it doesn't meet the requirements of the solicitation.
Or it may add additional solicitation-specific review criteria. We're asking them to review the proposal based on those criteria. You need to write that proposal based on those criteria. And a lot of folks just don't pay attention to those kinds of things that are in that solicitation, which is why we really focused on that this morning, because it seems very simplistic, but a lot of times it just doesn't pass that test.
So I don't know, Gene, maybe we should have a top 10 no-nos. But I can think of one that to me is sort of the tool of my trade. So if you write a proposal that's not clear and that's convoluted, guess how well that's going to be received by reviewers? It's going to be unclear and convoluted to them. And then you tell me what your likelihood of funding is. So spend whatever time you need, and the fact that we're less adhering to deadlines these days, to make sure your proposal is clear, understandable, and I think some of my colleagues mentioned, and let others read your proposal. And they'll say, you know, this paragraph makes no sense to me. Might make sense to you because you're too close to it. You understand what you were trying to say, but it might not be as clear to someone who is not as deeply familiar with the subject. So, you know, I think the clarity and expression of the ideas that you're trying to describe is really important.
I would also say hand-waving broader impacts, not looking back, that the merit review criteria, the 5 questions, apply to both the intellectual merit and the broader impacts. And increasingly, reviewers and program officers are looking at that.
5 is typos. Typos are a sign of sloppy work. You want to find somebody who does sloppy work?
I'm going to reiterate, actually, many reviewers' comments, and this was said earlier, will say, you know, broader impacts were standard. That's not going to help. So think about that. Think about the broader impacts. Think about, as well as the intellectual merit. You know, try not to pay lip service to things. You know, really, and provide evidence to back your assertions. You know, how is it going to be done? Do you have access to the resources and so on? So I'm just going to.
Okay, so I think the take home there is clear. You need to have a clear narrative to your grant. You need to be able to tell a story that not just the people who work right alongside you can understand. And you need to pay attention to broader impacts. So I've got one more perspective I want to share with you. So this is from a blog called Small Pond Science. Interesting and cool. As a novice grant writer many moons ago, I thought that appealing to the generalist or the specialist was a trade-off, and that by convincing one group, you would lose the other. And that managing this trade-off was the key to a good grant. As soon as I realized that no trade-off exists, I started to get funded. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll just go over some of the common mistakes that either I've seen in NSF proposals that I've read or that are frequently commented on by program officers. So the first one kind of harkens back to what has already been discussed. Specific aims that lack clarity and specificity. So you want your program officer, your reviewer, to be able to look at your summary page ideally and see your objectives and know exactly what you're going to do. You don't want them to have to figure it out on page 4. Don't ignore the page limits, the font size restrictions. So NSF is moving towards more automated systems. And so increasingly, they're going to kick out your grant without review if you try to skirt the page limits or use weird fonts. There's some caveats to that, so there's been some changes. So if you're using mathematical formulas and things like that, then some other non-standard fonts are allowed. But in general, you need to make sure that you're using a font that's okay, and don't try to like pull a fast one by like using A4 size pages instead of 8.5 by 11. Figures that are difficult to read or interpret. So, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but a figure that's really hard to understand is actually not helping you, and it's not conveying what it can convey. So figures take up a lot of space, and you want to make sure that every figure is earning its keep. Ideally, a reviewer can kind of just skim through and look at your figures. Ideally, you have a caption statement under your figure in bold that kind of explains the take home of that figure, and that everything in that figure is labeled really clearly so that it's really intuitive to look at. spelling and grammatical errors, of course, that makes you seem like you do sloppy work. They don't want to fund sloppy work. Missing required sections. So I see this more often than I would expect. So for NSF grants, this means that you absolutely need to have an intellectual merit, broader impacts, both in your project summary and in your project description. And you also need to include a description of prior NSF support. Even if you've never been supported before, you can just say that you haven't received any support. Not addressing solicitation-specific review criteria. So it's really important that you read the solicitation thoroughly and completely. A lot of times, you know, these solicitations will have additional criteria at the end, and you know, it's a little bit coded, so you need to read it a few times. But you know, they're trying really hard to communicate to you exactly what they're looking for. And so the degree to which you can echo back to them what you're doing in the same terms that they're using when they're requesting what they want to fund, that increases your chance of them looking favorably at your proposal. Like was mentioned at the panel in the NSF conference, underdeveloped broader impact section. So there's a lot of resources here at MSU for helping you develop your broader impacts. And I know that you guys just had a talk recently that was completely dedicated to broader impacts. So I can help connect you to resources. I know there's other people who can too, but this is something you don't want to wait until the last minute to do, and you do want to give it some real thought. Don't assume that a website is sufficient for dissemination. Don't assume that your past accomplishments are well known, you know, unless you're incredibly well established, and even then, not always. You really need to be able to sell yourself in addition to selling your science. And this is, you know, kind of a detail, but it's important. Don't provide support letters. So the NSF is really specific about the kind of commitment letters they want. They even have a template, and they're very bare bones. It's not some long letter about what, you know, this institution is going to do for you, or how you can use this piece of equipment, da 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 da. It's basically saying, I will do whatever the PI said I was going to do. My number one grantsmanship tip is that you need to remember that the reviewer is a human. I think a lot of times the person writing the proposal and the person reading the proposal have very different motivations, and that won't work out very well. So I know when you're writing the proposal, you want to make sure to get every piece of information into that proposal. You want it chock full. You want to have every detail. The reviewer is looking for specific things, and they don't want to see a wall of text. So you want to make it easy for them to find exactly what they're looking for. So one way you can do that is to incorporate white space in your page layout. So between paragraphs, after headings, around figures, make sure that when you're looking at the page, it's just not just really dense text. Create a narrative. Reviewers get bored too. So you want to tell them a story, and a really compelling story. Use concrete examples whenever you can. So a lot of times, especially if someone reading your grant is not like an expert in your field, it may not be immediately obvious what you're talking about or why the problem that you're identifying is important. And so when you can use a concrete, relatable example, that's going to make your grant, that's going to do a lot of work for you in terms of showing the significance of your proposal. Again, have someone else read your proposal. So preferably you would have a specialist, you know, someone who works very closely in your field, and a non-specialist, someone who doesn't know exactly what you do, and so see if they can understand what you're writing. It's important to use consistent terminology. I think people are afraid of being repetitive, but if you don't use the same term to refer to the same concept or phenomenon, it gets very confusing for the reader to have to refer back and say, oh, are they talking about the same thing now? So just pick one term and then use that throughout your grant. Again, make sure your figures are clear and easy to read. Don't use a tiny font. And use active verbs. It's really much easier to read sentences that are written in an active construction than passive construction. Admittedly, in the methods section, it's hard to avoid. But in general, especially when you're motivating your proposal in the beginning, you really want to use active verbs. And finally, don't wait until the last minute. There's a lot of resources here at MSU that can help you with this process. It always takes more time than you think it's going to take, especially if it's your first proposal. It's a lot of pieces. Reach out, get help. Even though NSF is moving towards not having deadlines, you still don't want to feel rushed. So before you start writing, another resource I want to point you in the direction of is ways to determine if your project is a good fit. So even if you write a really wonderful proposal, if it's not what NSF is looking to fund, it won't get funded. So again, I want to emphasize it's important to read the entire solicitation multiple times. Identify peers that are just a little bit ahead of you in their career, people who have recently won grants. Ask them what they applied for, ask them what they won, and most importantly, ask them if they'll let you see their proposal. Has anybody used the Federal Reporter in here to do research on grants? Okay, maybe afterwards I can walk you through it. It's a really great tool. So the Federal Reporter is basically a database that you can search for all federally funded grants. So for example, you could put in a keyword and then you can see it'll pop up this entire list of everything that's funded. So like NSF, NIH, DOD, USDA. And then you can kind of drill down in this list and see more details about the grant, who was the program officer, how much was the grant for. This is a great way of finding out if anybody at MSU is doing something similar. It's a great way of seeing what's been funded in the past to get a sense of how good of a match your proposal will be. You can also use the NSF website for specific NSF questions about what's been funded and how good of a match your proposal will be. So if you're trying to figure out which program officer you should reach out to if you have some questions about your proposal, using the NSF website is a great way of figuring out exactly which call makes sense and who you should contact. Right, and you can find out which program officer is cognizant. And then early on in the grant writing process, you should definitely contact the program officer. You want to reach out via email, don't cold call them. You want to include the important information that they really need to know. Don't send them an entire draft of your proposal. Keep it concise. So just include a summary of what you're planning on doing, and then also include like a CV or a bio sketch so they know who you are. In your email, you want to arrange to have a phone call to discuss your project. So it's important to have a phone call because then they can get a sense of who you are, and they may say things to you on the phone that they wouldn't necessarily say in an email. As NSF constantly reminds us, you should ask early and ask often, and this is particularly important right now. So, we just had this recent government shutdown, and the grant deadlines for NSF largely were unchanged. So if your deadline was during that shutdown, for the most part, you had to still submit it along the original timeline. And if in the last minute, you realize you have all these questions for your program officer, during the shutdown, they actually cannot communicate with you. So you don't want to wait until the last minute and you're really desperate. When you have questions, keep that line of communication open with your program officer. Ask the questions when you have them. Here's an example of the Federal Reporter. Forgot to put this in. So this is what the website looks like. You would just type in your search term. I put in SICADS here. And then it'll break down. You can look at it geographically. You can look at it by the funding agency. And then this is an example of the NSF website. So where you would want to look here is, so this is just the main website. You go to awards and then go to search awards. And it's at that point you can use keywords to look up active and archived awards. And then finally, to go back to the NSF recommendations, so broader impacts. So I know you've heard a lot about them. I just want to bring your attention to a couple of resources, general and at MSU, that are available to help you develop broader impact activities. So the National Alliance for Broader Impacts has guidelines specifically for developing broader impact activities for NSF proposals. And they have this really great document that I can either email to you or give you a paper copy of that helps you, it has these guiding questions that help you think about broader impact activities. And the questions are things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So, you know, it encourages you to be very specific in your plans for your activities. You know, talk about the number of students you're going to be impacting. Talk about how you're going to have an evaluation plan for your broader impact activities. And then MSU also has an Office for Outreach and Engagement, which is a wonderful resource. They have people who consult about evaluation on broader impact activities. They can help connect you to resources in the community and on campus. So I would encourage you to reach out to them as well. And finally, the Office of the Senior Vice President for Research and Innovation. So here's just kind of a list. You'll find this on their website of the types of services that they offer to PIs. And the one I'm going to focus on right here is the one that I'm involved in, which is special consulting services. And so, like I said, myself and Tom Holland, who specializes in NIH grants, we're here once a month. We're available to talk. Come see us. And we can assist with grant editing once you're to that stage in your proposal preparation as well. Through this office, there's also peer review coordination. And so you can email Jeff Croft, and he can set up something so that you can have your proposal reviewed by your colleagues. We can do first draft review. We can take a look at the structure of your proposal. We can help you explore funding. We also occasionally put on seminars and webinars. And finally, we also have hot seat sessions, which are one-day critique sessions with fellow MSU researchers who are applying to the same agency. So this is a great opportunity if you want really in-depth feedback. This is a picture from the last one we had some month or two ago. So this is Tom over here. We sat down with two PIs who were both applying for grants within the kind of broad topic of neuroscience. One was for an NSF proposal and one was an NIH proposal. And we took the whole day and really went over their proposals in depth. And I think both PIs found it to be like a very valuable experience, and they got a lot of really good feedback. And finally, I want to draw your attention, if any of you are thinking about applying for a career award, there's a career award panel discussion coming up on Thursday from 3 to 5 in the library. I definitely encourage you to attend. So thank you for your attention. If you have any questions.